Hari Om. Dear girls, in the software engineering course, we have completed the first three modules, in which the first module was completely about the introduction to software engineering, and it also deals with software development lifecycle models. We have discussed different models that are available in the SDLC, the different phases in the software development lifecycle models also was discussed. In the second module, we discussed the first phase of SDLC, which is nothing but requirement analysis and specification, in which we have discussed the four important phases of requirement engineering, which is the requirement elicitation, requirement analysis, requirement documentation, and the review of the requirements. We have also seen the output of the requirement analysis and specification phase will be the requirements document, which you call as software requirement specification document, SRS. Then in the third module, we discussed the second phase of software development lifecycle, which is the design phase. The SRS document, which is agreed between the customer and the developer, will be given to the design team for developing the software. So in this phase, we have discussed what do you mean by a software design, what are the different types of design available, what are the different design notations used in the design document, and what are the two important design methodologies available for the second phase, out of which we have discussed the two important methodologies. One is the function oriented design and the other one is called as object oriented design. In the third module itself, we have discussed what is the function oriented design and what are the different notations used in the function oriented design. Now in the fourth module, we are going to talk about the object oriented design. The very important design methodology that is used in the software design is what you call as object oriented design. Almost all the software industries which are dealing with real-time problems, when I say real-time problems, most of the business problems that we face in the real time are called as real-time problems. So all these business functions can be represented as a real-time problem, and these real-time problems will be approached based on the object-oriented concept. So any desktop application, a web application, or a console-based application, or even your mobile applications that you are going to develop, they are all dealing with real-time entities. So these real-time entities can be designed using object-oriented design. Today morning when we have joined in the Google Meet, we have discussed what is the basic difference between the function oriented design and the object oriented design. So your function oriented design will be focusing on the process, only then it will consider the data used in that particular process. Whereas the object oriented design will focus on the data, then the functions that are specified for that particular data or the entity will be analyzed. That is the very basic difference between function oriented design and object oriented design. So in the fourth module, we will talk about what is the object oriented design, what are the different concepts used, what are the different notations used, and what is the basic design methodology followed. And apart from that, we will also have a case study based on the object oriented design. So your software design is based on the function oriented design, or it may be object oriented design. Whenever we develop a software which is a single problem or which is used for a single task, then you can follow the function oriented design. So for small problems or the kind of embedded systems, if you're going to develop some kind of embedded systems, or you're going to develop a software for a numerical analysis, etc., then you can choose the function oriented design. But if you're going to use mainly the business functions that are involved in the real time entity, then you have to follow the object oriented design. So your object oriented design is generally the result of focusing the attention on the data that are to be manipulated by the program. Now, I have already explained an example for the function oriented design and the object oriented design. So we have seen the example of college management system. So if you follow the function oriented design, your focus will be on the admission process. Admission process is nothing but a function. So you focus on that particular function, then you define what are the data required for that particular function. Whereas if you are going to follow the object oriented model, then your focus will be on the data. So for the college management system, one of the data will be the student data. Then you will analyze about how the student data are to be manipulated by the program. So that is why we say object oriented design will be the result of focusing the attention on the data rather than the process. Now generally when you take the object oriented design, this design begins with an examination of real world things, or you call it as real world entities, which are going to be the part of the problem to be solved. Now generally these things which you call as the objects, the real-time things are otherwise known as real-time entities, or you call it as objects, and these objects will be characterized individually in terms of their attributes and behavior. So any object for that matter will have its own attribute and it will have its own behavior also. For example, in our object-oriented programming language like C++ and Java, any object will be first represented as a class abstraction. All of you remember how a class can be defined. So when you define a class, you define data members as well as method members. So these data members is what you call as the attributes of the object, and those method members is what you call as the behavior of that particular object. So any object for that matter in a problem can be defined or characterized based on its attributes as well as the behavior of the object. Now when you take the object oriented design, it is believed to be more natural and it provides richer structures for thinking and abstraction. Why? Because your object oriented design is generally used for the real time world. So this approach will become more natural. Not only that, it provides lots of structures for defining it as the abstraction. And also that the object oriented design closely represents the problem domain, so that because your object oriented design is used for representing a real time entity, and most of the problem domain will be having real-time entities. So you can have this object-oriented design to represent the problem domain easily, and you can easily understand the problem domain using the object-oriented design also. And not only that, it is different from the function oriented approach. Why? Because different abstraction that is used in the object oriented design can be easily represented in the OOD model. And not only that, partitioning and identifying the classes in the particular problem domain is also easy for the object oriented design. Now, when you take the object-oriented design, your object-oriented approach follows object-oriented analysis as well as object-oriented design. Now, when you say the analysis and design, the analysis of the real world problem, the analysis of the real world problem will be representing the problem domain. So, what exactly is the problem can be understood using the object-oriented analysis. Any real-world problem can be understood if you have the proper object-oriented analysis. That is why we, in this diagram, it represents object-oriented analysis will be focusing on the problem domain. So what you are going to do? The problem domain. What is the problem? That can be represented using object-oriented analysis. Whereas the solution for the problem can be represented using the object-oriented design. So what happens? You analyze for the particular problem and that can be represented, and the input from this problem domain will be given for the design work, so that the solution domain can be represented using the object oriented design. So that is how the OOA and OOD is defined in the object oriented concept. Now, when you take the object-oriented design, obviously we need to understand what are the different concepts used in the object-oriented design. So your object-oriented design is not dependent on any specific implementation language. No implementation language is defined here. All the problems will be modeled using the objects. We are not talking about the object-oriented programming language. Rather, we are talking about the object-oriented design model for a particular problem. So, in the object-oriented design, problems will be modeled using the objects. Whatever entity you have in the problem, that will be represented as an object, and the objects will have a behavior and it will have states also. So, when I say behavior, it will be the functions of the object. That means they do these things, that can be represented as a behavior. These are the functions done by that particular object. Say for example, if you take matrix as an object, then addition, subtraction are the behavior of the matrix object. Then state. State is another thing that will be used in the object. So states will be changing based on the behavior. When you perform a particular function, the state of the object will be changed. Say for example, if you have a student information, if you have a if you have a candidate information, the function that can be applied on the candidate information is the admission process. Once you have applied the admission process, the state of the candidate will be changed to a student. So before admission process, the information of the student is known as the candidate, whereas after the admission process, the information of the candidate becomes the student. So before the admission process, the entity is called as a candidate. That is the state of that particular entity. Now, how do you change the state of the state of the entity from candidate to student? How do you change it? When you apply the admission process. So admission process is the behavior. States are two states. What is the first state? First state is candidate. Second state is it becomes the student. The state will be changing based on the behavior. So behavior is nothing but a function applied on the object. When you apply this function, the state of that particular object will be changing. So these are the two things that will be available for a particular object. Then we are going to just see some of the terms that are used in the object-oriented design. These are the different terms that are used. One is called as an object. Object is nothing but an entity which is able to save a state information, and it offers number of operations, which is nothing but the behavior, or you call it as functions, to either examine or affect that particular state. So you want to check the state of the entity, then you need a behavior, or you want to change the state of the entity, then you need a behavior. So every entity will have some set of states. Every entity will have some set of states. All these states can be tested or it can be changed by using number of operations. That is what is an object, and any object will be characterized by the number of operations and a state which remembers the effect of these operations. So this is a very simple definition that you can have for an object. So this object word is frequently, it is used very frequently, and it conveys different meanings in different circumstances also. Okay, in each and every circumstance, the meaning of this particular object will be varying. So meaning here in the object oriented design, the meaning of an object is an entity which is able to save a state information, and it offers a number of operations to examine or to affect the state. Therefore, we can say an object is characterized by number of operations and a state which remembers the effect of these operations. This is how you have to define, right? It says that the word object can be used very frequently, and it has different meanings in different circumstances. In the object-oriented design, and the meaning of an object is defined as an entity which is able to save a state information, and it offers a number of operations to test it or to change the state. Therefore, you can say an object is characterized by number of operations and a state which remembers the effect of these operations. Now, when you have the objects, all the objects will have unique identification and will be distinguishable also. Each and every object will have its own identification. For example, two bananas may be of same color, right? If you have banana, it may be of same color, shape and texture, but still they are different. Say for example, I can have two students. You can have same properties, like both the students are studying in the same course and they are studying for the same semester, and they are having commonly 5 subjects, and for each subject they have attendance timetable, etc., can be defined. But even then, some uniqueness will be there for each student. What is the unique information? The name of the student and the roll number of the student is very, very unique. Even sometimes name can also be same. So the roll number or the register number becomes the very unique information of that particular student. So you can say each object will have its own unique identification and will be distinguishable using that identification. Okay. Now, when you take the objects, your objects, when you are going to use the object during the object-oriented analysis, these objects will be focusing on the problem domain. So, your object-oriented analysis will focus on what is the problem domain, and it represents the entities or the concepts based on that particular problem. And all the objects that are used in the problem domain will be called as semantic objects, and each will have a meaning in the problem domain also. So for object oriented analysis, you need objects which will be representing the meaning, which will be representing the things or the concepts in that particular problem. That is why we call these objects as semantic objects, so that it gives a meaning in the problem domain. Whereas the objects during the object oriented design will be changed literally. How do you change it? It will focus on the solution. Here all the objects will be focusing on the problem, but here in the design all the objects will be focusing on the solution domain. So if it is focusing on the solution domain, what are the things? It will consist of semantic objects as well as other related objects. Whatever objects are related to the semantic objects, that will also be there. And these semantic objects identified during object-oriented analysis will be refined, and it can be extended from the point of view of the implementation. So how I am going to solve the problem, based on that these objects will be refined. And not only that, other objects that are added, other objects will also be added which will be specific to the solution domain. And it will include objects like interface, application and utility objects. So that is the interesting part here. When you have the object oriented design, you will have lots of semantic objects that are that are derived from the analysis, right? So what you are going to do, these semantic objects will have some related objects also. Now all these related objects will be specific to the solution domain. And not only that, these objects are to communicate. I mean, these objects are created to communicate with each other. So if they want to communicate, they need an interface between them. So you will have interfaces to have communication between the objects. You will have the application which is integrating all these objects, and you will have some utility objects that supports the semantic objects also. So these are the different kinds of objects you will be using in the object oriented design. And not only that, so what are the kinds of objects you have? Objects of the problem domain, objects of the solution domain. In the solution domain, you need interface, application and utility objects. So all these interface objects will be dealing with the user interface, and this is not directly a part of the problem domain, but it will represent some aspects of the solution desired by the user. So if you want to communicate with the objects, you need a kind of interface which will be the user interface, and those user interfaces will be represented as an object. Apart from that, you need to have a control mechanism for the solution. So to specify the control mechanism for the proposed solution, what you are going to do, you are going to use the application object. All the objects that are defined in the solution domain need to be controlled, for which I am going to use the application object. And these application objects are the driver objects which will be specific to the application needs. Then you have utility objects which will be needed to support the services of the semantic objects. That is what I told you in the previous slide. So you need utility objects which will be supporting the semantic objects. Interface object which is used for communication between the objects, and the application object which is used for the control mechanism. So apart from semantic objects that defines the problem domain and the solution domain, you need three important kinds of objects. What are they? Interface objects, application objects, and utility objects. Interface object is used for the communication between the objects which will be dealing with the user interface, and the application objects is used for the control mechanism, and the utility objects are used for providing support, those needed to support the services of the semantic objects. These are the different types of objects available. Now, apart from these kinds of objects, we have to understand what are the different terms used in the object-oriented design also. So let us discuss what are the different terms that are related to object-oriented design in our next video. Thank you.